Well, Mark and Ambassador Schneider, thanks very much for just the opportunity to be with you. It was fun to be with you on the panel this morning and listen to my colleagues from around the world opine on a variety of things, including this notion of what really constitutes soft power, smart power, or any other kind of power. And what I thought I had in mind other things that I might chat with you about this afternoon until I went through that experience and then saw the youthful nature of the audience. So I thought I might focus a little bit more on the learning curve as lifelong learners that we all must continue to go through to keep ourselves relevant in the world and in our countries and even in our businesses and our families as the clock goes by and the days go by. It reminds me of a story of about 4 students who were chemistry students at pick your university, and they were very good students. They were getting A's through the course of this chemistry course in their sophomore year, and they thought they were doing so well that when it came time to consider whether or not to study hard or not worry about it so much, when a final exam time came around, they decided they would go off and they were convinced they knew their material so well that they'd do just fine on the exam. So went off and did some partying and came back to campus late on the morning, or late in the evening, the day before the exam, and finally got jittery as to whether or not they had adequately prepared themselves for this final, and they put together a group story between the 4 of them that said they would miss the final, then they would approach their teacher and they would tell him that on the way back to take the final they had a flat tire, couldn't get back in time, and could we take the exam the next day? So they did that. They went in to see the professor after the final had been given to all the other students, and the professor said, "Sure, okay, I think that'll be all right. You can take the exam tomorrow." So they came in to take the exam tomorrow. The professor put them in each a separate room, gave them a booklet of the final chemistry exam, and they each opened the first page, and it was a 5-point question on the exam. If they, having studied very hard the night before, they were up to that, and they each felt that they had done very, very well and were feeling pretty confident about themselves. And then they turned over the second page of the exam, and it said, "For 95 points, which tire?" So the notion of being surprised in your challenges, wherever they may be, and being focused on the rather simple but very, very powerful notion of staying prepared, thinking you're prepared, and then being agile and adaptable enough to cope with whatever follows is sort of part and parcel of this idea of the title that I've chosen for my remarks this afternoon, which is this notion of a new normalcy. I can't tell you how often in the jobs that I had, I was still in uniform as the Commandant of the Coast Guard on 9/11, and was in that capacity through May of the following year when the President asked me to stand up TSA. So yes, if you're taking your shoes off the airport, I'm the guy that's sort of responsible for that to a degree. And then the 2 years in standing up TSA, and then the 2 years standing up DHS, where I had the extraordinary opportunity to work not only with Tom Ridge, the first secretary, but with Michael Chertoff as well. The notion of recognizing that whatever had happened on 9/11/01 for this country and more for the rest of the world as time goes by, there's almost a demarcation line between the old times of the Cold War and the new times post 9/11. And of course, most of us think about the Cold War ending in 1989 with the fall of the wall and the implosion of the Soviet Union, and that's all well and good. But then there's this 12-year interregnum between 1989 and 2001, where in many instances we heard phrases like how we're going to spend the peace dividend, and we spent the peace dividend time and time again. And at the other end of the day, were dramatically surprised, as were those students who turned over to the second page of the exam with the dramatic events of 9/11/01. And all of a sudden, the quest was from many voices, when are we going to get back to normal? And by normal, they meant 9/10/01 or behind. And whoever thought we'd be pining for the good old days of the Cold War, but in many ways, the rather simplistic nature of what the Cold War represented, a bipolar kind of structure to the world at large, often the balancing influence of one versus the other in the interest of safety and security for literally the rest of the world. And that was gone. And in this post-9/11 security environment, the challenge was to understand what were the framing elements, what were the attributes, what were the notions that constituted, so to speak, the new normalcy, and were we actually embarked on a trip of some kind that would help us identify what was the new normalcy, and were we on the right path to get there. And I think we often find in the aftermath of such an extraordinary event that is the case. To me, some of it at the very beginning of those days was to recognize just sort of how the United States of America handles a tragedy. And I don't think it's that different from other countries who have experiences like that over time. But I'm certainly not the person to answer that question. Other colleagues from other countries, and for many of you around this table representing your own countries, can answer that for yourselves. But for me, one of the stories I like to tell has nothing to do with international diplomacy, cultural or otherwise, soft power or any other kind of power. But let me tell you the story because I think it's emblematic of the way America handles tragedies, and therefore probably the way most countries handle tragedies as they're exposed to them or as they occur. And I would only tell you just very briefly the story of Exxon Valdez. Exxon Valdez, of course, were back in March of 1989 when 11 million gallons of crude oil were dumped into an extraordinarily pristine environment in Prince William Sound in Alaska. Absolutely no doubt that it was an environmental tragedy. And how did America handle that? Well, impulsively first, and over the course of the next 8 months to 9 months, a piece of legislation was drafted that became the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. That was impactful around the world. It had to do with double-hulled tankers carrying crude oil wherever it was going to go. It had to do with all kinds of rules and regulations imposed by the International Maritime Organization, because in fact what had happened was a ship-oriented tragedy in Prince William Sound. But the other thing that occurred was to think about whether or not this Oil Pollution Act of 1990, one piece of legislation, solved the problem. And what I can tell you is, as I was retiring from the Coast Guard as an officer in 2002, barely 11 or 12 years later, I was signing off on the 107th regulatory adjustment to the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. And I offer you that as nothing more than a strap to hold on to in the subway while we're thinking about the parallels associated with the post 9/11 security environment and attempting to describe what normalcy may or may not be about that period in our history. And as I said this morning in the panel, I'm absolutely convinced that historians 50 years from now are going to be looking back at 9/11/01 in our country as every bit a demarcation point as any other major event that has occurred in our couple of hundred years of history. So if you fast forward to the post 9/11 security environment, and you think about the Safety Act, the Patriot Act, the Aviation Transportation Security Act, Homeland Security Act, the Maritime Transportation Security Act, et cetera, probably as many as 23 very, very impactful pieces of legislation, and just as many executive orders coming out of the White House about the same or sort of adjacent kind of substance and content. And you think about that 107 regulatory adjustments to the one piece of legislation known as the Oil Pollution Act. Think of the change dimension that is going on here as we attempt to go from whatever constituted the old normalcy, that which we sort of had this emotional quest to go back and regain as the impactful change of 9/11 occurred to all of us here in this country.